Nothing more exciting than seeing a young couple catch the vision of proclaiming the gospel, especially in a place like East Africa where they're going, where the gospel just really hasn't been proclaimed in any significant way. Starting a new series of messages today that'll take us all the way up right to Easter, looking at the Old Testament feasts. And so the particular feast we're looking at today is the Feast of Passover, and the primary text that talks about the Feast of Passover is in Exodus 12, although we'll be looking at several other passages in Exodus as well. But let me just ask you what your favorite holiday is. I mean, we just came through Christmas, so that's probably on your mind. There's Thanksgiving, which is kind of our free day from our diets. We can eat whatever we want to eat on that one day of the year. There's 4th of July with all of its fireworks and fun things that happen. And there are lots of other holidays. And there are times when we gather with our family. Sometimes we exchange gifts, we have feasts and celebrate and party, and they're great things. And any holiday where you get a day off of work is not something to be sad about at all. Of course, the holidays that we celebrate, all of them are more than just their festivities. It's not just about partying. It's not just about celebrating. For each of our holidays, there is a deeper meaning, even though for some who celebrate, that meaning may be forgotten or that meaning may be ignored. But all of them are remembering something. They're remembering an event. They're remembering a person. They're remembering some kind of blessing that we receive. They're remembering some kind of responsibility that's been given to us. They're about remembering. Each of them is a reminder of something that we don't want to forget. And so we celebrate most of these holidays on an annual basis in order to remind us of those things. Now, for the people of Israel, God established a whole series of holidays for that same reason. They are each about remembering something that God had done among the people of Israel so that the people of Israel would remember. They would remember what God had done, and they would give praise and thanksgiving to God. God didn't want his people ever to forget. But from God's perspective, there was more to each of these celebrations than just a look to the past and what God had already done in the past. In every one of the feasts that we're going to look at, there's about 10 of them, in every one of these feasts, most of them celebrated on an annual basis, there was not just a look at the past, but also there was some aspect of the feast that would point toward the future and something that God was going to do in the future among his people. And so there is a prophetic part to every one of the feasts that we're going to look at. Now, some of those things that God predicted were going to happen in the future, from our perspective, are now in the past. They weren't when the feasts were established, but now many of those things that these feasts point to were accomplished in the coming of Jesus the first time. But some of the things these feasts point to are yet to be accomplished and will be accomplished in the second coming of Jesus, as we see, as we move through some of these feasts. As I've studied these feasts, I've come away impressed with God, because through them, God points so clearly to the coming of Jesus and to the ministry of Jesus. And so we're going to take a look at these feasts. And today, we begin with the Passover. And there are two images that surround the Passover that I want us to focus on. The first is the image of bondage, and the second is the image of sacrifice. So Passover begins with the image of bondage. To understand the Passover, you have to understand the history of the people of Israel. The people of Israel, as most of us remember, were the descendants of Abraham through his grandson Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. When Jacob and his family were just a small group, Exodus chapter 1 says there were just 70 people in Jacob's family at this time. That would be a group that you might be able to gather in a meeting hall for a Thanksgiving celebration. That was the kind of size of group that it was, 70 people. Just Jacob and his wives and his sons. He had 12 sons, although one of them was already gone by then. So there were 11 sons left, and his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, 70 in total. And Jacob and his family moved from Israel, the land of Canaan, to Egypt because there was a famine in Israel. Now Joseph, one of Jacob's sons, had already gone ahead. And he, in a kind of a strange way, had been sent ahead by his brothers, and he'd risen to a place of prominence in Egypt and was able to take care of the rest of his family as they came from Canaan to Egypt and took up residence there. Years passed, and this 70 people began to grow. In fact, they grew so much that the people of Egypt began to be afraid. They were afraid that there were so many among these Israelites that at some point the Israelites would rise up in rebellion and take over the country of Egypt. And so the Egyptians began to oppress the people of Israel. The people of Israel were made slaves in Egypt. 400 years passed. The people of Israel, now numbering perhaps as many as 1 million people, were still bound in slavery. They were toiling at hard labor, and they were being ruthlessly abused by harsh slave masters. Here's what Exodus chapter 1 says about those days. The Egyptians made their lives, that's the Israelites' lives, bitter with hard labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. And in all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. So it was not a pleasant experience to be in slavery for the people of Israel. And a turning point came for the people of Israel when they cried out to God for help. Now, you have to ask, since these were God's people, that's what the people of Israel were and are, since these were God's people, why would God allow them to go on under oppression for such a long period of time? How could he leave them as slaves in the land of Egypt? And I think the answer to that is found in the story as it's told in the book of Exodus. The Bible says, Exodus chapter 2, verse 23 through 25, the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. And their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. I think what God was waiting for was for the people to get to a place of desperation from which they would cry out to him for help. As long as the people of Israel were willing to think they could handle what was going on, they could tough it out, they could take care of themselves, or perhaps they could somehow wrest freedom from the Egyptians on their own. As long as they were thinking they could handle it on their own, God was willing to allow them to do that. But when they finally came to that point of desperation, when they groaned in their slavery and cried out to God, it was then that God responded and gave them the help and rescued them. Now, I think that's an important lesson for us to learn that comes out of the Passover story. That God did come to the rescue of his people. But how did the people of Israel access the rescue that came to them from God? They accessed that rescue by crying out to God for help. And in your life and in my life, God is willing to allow us to take care of our lives on our own. For as long as we think we can handle our own problems, God is willing to allow us to handle our own problems. If you think your sin is not that bad, and you can deal with your sin and make corrections in your life on your own, God will let you do that. If you think that the future is secure and you can handle whatever issues might arise in your future, God will let you do that. If you think, I can even tough it out and make it through death, God will let you do that. It's only when we come to the place when we recognize we can't handle it on our own and cry out to God for help that he comes to our rescue. God's rescue of the people of Israel started when he called Moses to be the tool, the instrument that he would use to accomplish that rescue. For 40 years, Moses lived in the obscurity of the desert, taking care of his father-in-law's sheep. And then in that familiar passage in Exodus, God spoke to Moses out of the burning bush and called Moses to go back to Egypt, where he'd been raised for the first 40 years of his life, and to lead the people of Israel to their freedom. Another key lesson of the Passover story comes when Moses gathered the people of Israel and told them that God had sent him to lead them to freedom. Exodus chapter 4, verse 29 to 31, it says, Moses and Aaron, that's Moses' brother, brought together all the elders of the Israelites, and Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses. And he also performed signs before the people, and they believed. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshiped. So the first key lesson from Passover is that the people cried out to God for help and he came to their rescue. The second key lesson is here, that when God sent his answer, the people of Israel believed him. They trusted him. They responded positively to the answer that God had sent. And so with the people of Israel now ready to follow Moses, then God sent Moses to Pharaoh to ask Pharaoh and the people of Egypt to release the Israelites from their slavery and let them go free. Now, the first time that Moses spoke to Pharaoh, he told him exactly what God wanted. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the desert. And Pharaoh said, no, I'm not going to let you go. And God allowed Moses to perform sign after sign in order to demonstrate to Pharaoh and to the people of Egypt that God, the powerful Almighty God, was with Moses and wanted the people of Egypt to allow Israel to go free. The consequences of those signs that Moses brought to the people of Egypt were more and more harsh as each sign was delivered, one after the other. And yet Pharaoh continued to resist. He continued to say no. And in a final sign of astounding severity, God both demonstrated how much he could protect his own people and also how high a price there was when you refused to listen to what God wanted. And it is that final sign that is the core element of the Passover celebration. So the central element of the Passover is a lamb. It is the image of sacrifice. The signs God gave to Moses touched many areas of the lives of the people of Egypt. Some of these signs were frustrating and inconvenient. I mean, you can imagine frogs hopping all over your house and everywhere else that you turn. That would be frustrating and inconvenient. And some of the signs brought economic hardship. Locusts sweeping through the land of Egypt and eating up all of their crops. And some of the signs brought physical pain. There were boils that popped up on the bodies of the Egyptians. But the final sign that God sent was a plague of devastation among all who would not listen to him. Exodus 11, verses 4 and 5. This is what the Lord says. After midnight, I will go throughout Egypt, and every firstborn son in Egypt will die. From the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the slave girl who is at her handmill, and even all the firstborn of the cattle. But for those who would listen to God, God provided a way to avoid the devastation of that plague. And that's the story that Passover celebrates. Exodus chapter 12, beginning in verse 2 down through verse 13. This month is to be for you the first month. It's going to start the time all over again when Passover came. Month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the people of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. And that same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or cooked in water, but roasted over the fire, head, legs, and inner parts. Do not leave any of it till morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt, for I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. Now, the sacrifice of the lamb accomplished two things for the people of Israel. It saved them from the plague of death that came across Egypt that night. Now, understand, it wasn't the blood that saved the Israelites. It wasn't like the blood was made into a vaccine and they took a vaccine and that saved them from the disease. It was God who saved the people of Israel. And the blood was just a sign. It was a sign that the people of Israel believed what God said, that he really was going to send the death angel that night. Believed what God said, that this sign would protect them when the death angel came. It was a sign of their faith. It freed them, secondly, from their bondage as slaves. That night, Pharaoh and the people of Egypt urged the people of Israel to leave. That very night, they were released from their bondage as slaves. Exodus chapter 12, verse 31 to 33 says, during the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, and he said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country. They were released from their bondage. The plague of death was the final straw that broke the power of slavery over the lives of the Israelites. God saved the Jews that night on the basis of their faith. God told them what to do to avoid the plague of death, and they believed what God said. They trusted that what God said was true, and they acted on what God said. They killed the lamb, and they sprinkled the blood of the lamb on the doorposts, on the sides, and on the tops. And that's a perfect illustration of what faith is. It's a sacrifice of the lamb that the Jews gather to remember every year when they celebrate the Passover feast. They eat another lamb year after year after year to reenact that first Passover. And they tell again the story of their deliverance from their slavery. God saved them. But here's the key point that we need to remember as we study the Passover feast. It is that Jesus is our Passover lamb. It's not that we look at what Jesus did and we think, wow, that's kind of like what God did back there 1,500 years ago. But rather, it is that God, in his perfect plan and according to his perfect foreknowledge, he worked the miracle of the first Passover in order to put into place a picture of what he would do through Jesus. 1,500 years before Jesus was born, God painted a picture so that when Jesus came, the Jews might remember that picture and know that Jesus is God's Messiah. So when Jesus walked into his ministry and he came to where John the Baptist was baptizing, and here was John standing with some of his disciples, and John saw Jesus walking by. And John says to his disciples as he points toward Jesus, "Look, the Lamb of God comes to take away the sin of the world. Or Paul is even clearer. When he wrote to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he said, "For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival. Therefore, let us celebrate. Because Christ is our Passover lamb. He is the one who has saved us from the plague of death. He is the one who has freed us from our bondage to sin." It's not an ironic coincidence. It is in the plan of God that Jesus was crucified during the week in which the Jews of his day were celebrating the Passover feast. The timing of his death was a part of God's prophetic plan designed to make clear what he was accomplishing through that death. The beginning of the celebration of the Passover each year started on the 10th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan. They count their time differently than we do. And so the Passover was celebrated every year, beginning on the 10th day of Nisan. That was the day they picked out their lamb. They went out to the flocks, the sheep or the goats, and they picked out their lamb that was to be the sacrifice for them. Exodus says, chapter 12, verse 3, "Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. And they would take that lamb on the 10th day of Nisan, and they would watch it, and they would protect it. They would inspect it to be sure that it was without blemish, and they would care for it from the 10th until the 14th. And on the 14th day of Nisan, they would sacrifice the lamb." In Jesus' day, not only did each family choose a lamb for their own family Passover feast, but the high priest also chose a lamb. He chose a lamb for the whole nation of Israel to represent God's deliverance for the whole nation of Israel. And so the high priest would go outside the city of Jerusalem, out of the fields where the sheep and the goats were cared for. And he would examine the fields, the flocks that were there, and he would pick out the best among the flock. And he would take the best one-year-old lamb that he could find, and he would choose that lamb. And he would lead that lamb back into the city of Jerusalem. And the people knew when the high priest was bringing the lamb back into the city of Jerusalem. And so they would line the streets of Jerusalem, and they would lift their voices in praise, waving their hands or the boughs that they'd picked up from the lawn. And they would lift their voices in praise, and they would proclaim, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds familiar to me. Because on the 10th day of Nisan was a Sunday, the year that Jesus died. And Jesus came from outside the city of Jerusalem into the city of Jerusalem. And the people lined the streets. Maybe they were there because the high priest had just before passed through with the lamb. But the people were lining the streets, and they lifted their hands, and they waved their boughs, and they lifted their voices, and they said, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." It is not an ironic coincidence that that happened on the 10th day of Nisan. We call it the triumphal entry, Palm Sunday. It is the beginning of Passover. The real Passover lamb had been chosen outside the city of Jerusalem, and he came in to present himself as a sacrifice for his people. The high priest would take the lamb that had been chosen, and he would take him to the temple, and he would put that lamb in public view so that people could examine that lamb to make sure that it was perfect, and they could watch that lamb to make sure that nothing happened to it. In that last week of Jesus' life each day, following the triumphal entry, Jesus came into the temple, and he presented himself so the people could inspect him and watch him and hear him. And the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they asked him questions. And they tried to trick him. They could not. It was perfect, without blemish. And then on the day of Passover, they took the chosen lamb and they killed it. And on the final Passover in Jesus' life, they took him and they arrested him and they hung him on a cross. Like the Passover lambs, not a bone of Jesus was broken. Exodus 12, verse 46, do not break any of the bones. During Passover, a sign was hung around each lamb's neck. I mean, you got millions of people who were bringing their lambs to the temple to be killed, and so they had to identify them to make sure they got their own lamb back, and they hung a sign around that said the name of the owner. And when Jesus was killed, they hung a sign over his head, his owner, King of the Jews. I can tell you one more interesting tidbit. For the Passover, each lamb was roasted over fire, just like Moses said it was to be in Exodus 12. It was an interesting instruction given in Exodus 12, verse 9. It says that a spit of wood was to be used to skewer the lamb from head to rear. That was to be the spit that was to be used to rotate the lamb as it was roasted. According to Justin Martyr, who was a Christian leader that lived about 100 years after Jesus, he said there was a second spit that was also attached to the lamb. This one was attached or strung through the lamb shoulder to shoulder. And it stuck out on each side so that the meat wouldn't touch the oven as the lamb went round and round being barbecued, because that touching the oven would defile the meat. And so here was the lamb, one piece of wood head to toe, one piece of wood shoulder to shoulder. Every lamb was roasted on a cross. Still today, if you go to Samaria, where they celebrate the Passover, they still do it that same way. Every lamb roasted on a cross. Each year, when the Jewish family had finished eating their Passover feast together, they sang a song. It was a hymn. The same song every year. It was a tradition. They didn't get tired of singing the same song year after year after year. The gospel records that on that Passover night, that last Passover night in Jesus' life, he and his disciples sang a song too. As they went out from the Passover meal to the Garden of Gethsemane, it would have been the same song that all the other Jews were singing at Passover as well. I can't sing it for you today because the music has disappeared, but we still have the words. They're recorded in Psalm 118. It's an interesting hymn. You can read it all sometime, but let me just quote for you just a few verses from that psalm, verses 22 through 29. The stone the builders rejected has become the capstone. The Lord has done this, and it's marvelous in our eyes. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. O Lord, save us. O Lord, grant us success. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. From the house of the Lord we bless you. The Lord is God, and he has made his light shine upon us. With boughs in hand, join in the festal procession up to the horns of the altar. You are my God, and I will give you thanks. You are my God, and I will exalt you. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Each year, the Jews, as they finished the Passover meal, would lift their voices and they would sing a song about Jesus, although they didn't even know it. Well, there's a lot more that we could say about the Passover, but let me wrap up by asking you this. Are you still in bondage? Bound by your own sin? Are you still plagued by the fear of death? You don't need to be. You don't need to be in bondage to your sin because the price has already been paid. You don't need to be afraid of the plague of death because death has already been defeated. And we can access that freedom, that salvation, in the same way that the Jews accessed their deliverance in that first Passover. First, you cry out to God for help. You recognize you can't do it on your own. can't deal with your own sin, can't overcome your own death, and you cry out to God for help. And then, when he sends his rescue, who is Jesus, you believe him. You trust in him. You believe that what God said and what Jesus did is absolutely true. And you act on that belief by doing what God asks you to do. I declare to you today that Jesus is my Passover lamb. He's freed me from my bondage to sin. He's overcome the plague of the fear of death. If that's true for you, then join me in celebrating our Passover lamb. If it's not true for you, it can be today. Cry out to God and believe the rescue that he sent. Let's stand as we sing our song of commitment today. And if God's working in your heart and life in some way to which you need to respond publicly, to talk with one of us, be several staff members down here at the front, we'd be happy to talk to you, to pray with you if you need to respond today.